Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, Scope 3 Data Collection Demystified, Assessment, Suppliers and Compliance. Thank you for joining us today. So today we have with us our Chief Strategy Officer Yeshvanth and ESG Lead Meenakshi sharing their insights. So this session will focus on practical challenges in Scope 3 data collection, supplier engagement, and moving towards audit-ready decision-grade emission data. So we'll begin the webinar shortly after the Mission Live video, after which Yashwant will take over.
We are just a tiny speck in this vast universe. But are we sure the truth is only what meets the eye? Think again. This is our doing. We have plagued and poisoned Mother Earth with our selfish motives. India, known for large-scale behavioral change programs, has once again recognized the urgency and has led the global alliance with Mission Life.
मिशन लाइफ क्लाइमेट चेंज के खिलाफ लड़ाई का लोकतांत्रिक डेमोक्रेटिक एक प्रकार से उसका विस्तार कर रहा है, जिससे हर कोई अपने सामर्थ्य के हिसाब से योगदान दे सकता है। मिशन लाइफ इस बात पर भरोसा करता है कि छोटे छोटे प्रयासों का भी व्यापक प्रभाव हो सकता है। मिशन लाइफ हमें प्रेरित करता है कि हम सब अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी में ऐसा बहुत कुछ कर सकते हैं जिससे पर्यावरण की सुरक्षा हो।
Revolutionizing general outlook, our Prime Minister envisions to change individual and community behavior to bring in significant impact on the environmental and climate crisis. Life's objective to take individual and collective action for protecting and conserving the environment. Looking to bring in paradigm shift, Mission Life envisions three core transformations: change in demand, change in supply, and change in policy. Simplistically put, Lifestyle for Environment is a mission to help you identify simple acts in our daily lives that can contribute significantly to climate change. The ideology is designed keeping in mind that the actions would be specific and measurable, easy to practice by individuals, communities, and institutions, and non-disruptive to ongoing economic activity, and in fact promoting economic activity on the foreseeable future. So let's take a pledge today and show to the world that we are environmental conscious and can lead the path for the world to follow. Lifestyle for Environment.
Hey, Anjali, can we begin?
Yes, Yashwant, you may take over.
Okay, cool. Good evening, one and all here. It gives me immense pleasure to be joining this discussion alongside with my colleague Meenakshi to talk to you all about what's happening in the world of Scope 3, why Scope 3, and then what are the challenges that companies or industries face, and what can be done as growing organizations from our end out of India is what we'll majorly cover based out of today's webinar. And before even getting deeper into the concept, right, I want to take a step back and understand why are even people talking about Scope 3, right? Like, so just today I had a couple of meetings with manufacturing companies. In that, one of a plant head, so they're starting to work on the Scope 3 journey today. They were asking me, my international counterpartner is giving me net zero, and then they're asking me to do Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. What is net zero? So as much as I found, as much as I was amazed, I saw that there's a clear intent that people in India are starting to understand. While it has not been their KRA, while it has not been their expertise, people are adapting and adopting. That's how India has always grown, right? Like we've taken benchmarks from international standards, and whatever has helped us grow, we have adopted it. So did take a moment to pause and help them understand what it is. So I thought I'll just give a larger context also, right? So we all know globally, we have taken a global target to be net zero, at least towards net zero by 2050 mid. And different countries have taken a different timeline. Say India has taken 2070. It is to ensure that the entire global temperature is maintained less than 1.5 degree raise in Celsius, so that global warming can be avoided. This is a larger picture by why we all are talking about carbon emissions or carbon equivalent emissions and reducing that and all the processes, right? Now, to take a step further to understand what is scope and scope 2, scope 3, I thought I'll just pull up a small layman, everyone, small analogy which every layman can also understand, and then we'll get into a presentation which Meenakshi will share, right? So let me just share my screen. Meenakshi or Anjali, do let me know once my screen is visible.
It's visible.
Yeah, it's visible.
Perfect. So I think at least in our lives, most of us will know something about bakery, or at least been to a bakery or eat some good, delicious cakes or cookies out of bakery. So that I'll take an example, a journey of a bakery to help understand what is scope and scope to scope 3. Why is it such a complex thing that manufacturing companies are talking about today? Okay. So in scope and emissions, if it is for a bakery, the emissions that comes out of the gas that happens during the baking processes, or their own vehicles. If a bakery owns their own vehicles and all the petrol or diesel that gets consumed in that, right? All the emissions with regard to energy within a company's purview, right? A bakery's purview is scope and emissions. This bakery has to function, right? So they have to also get other forms of energy to maintain all the electrical appliances function, right? That is electricity. All the electricity that has been taken in from the grid, which is from the country's grid, right? And it could be Bescom or different team as per the states you live in. So all the electricity that gets purchased inside the bakery to run the fridge or fan or lights and all other equipments, right? So that is called scope 2 emissions. The emissions associated with the electricity. If someone had to ask you what is emission associated with scope 2, for the electricity to be here inside, someone is burning coal somewhere else, right? That's when the energy is converted from coal to electricity, and we are functioning here. So the emissions tied to the coal burning there, right? That is scope 2, for which we will calculate the emissions. Now, what is scope 3? Everything outside these outside the bakery, right, is scope 3. Let it be from the upstream or the downstream. Let it be the upstream or downstream, it is all scope 3 emissions, right? Say example, the raw materials that the bakery will procure, right? It could be wheat, maida, sugar, everything, right? Right from the processing of the raw materials to the transportation of the raw materials, and that transportation will come in either trucks or courier or whatever form factors, right? If the bakery owner had to go buy all of these raw materials, all the emissions tied to those processing, all the procurement, all the shipment, right? All that is part of scope 3. That is inwards. Similarly, for outwards, if a bakery had to go give it to a e-commerce company like a Swiggy or Zomato or any third-party company to go deliver it to someone, right? The emissions tied to that on a petrol scooter or a diesel vehicle, all the emissions coming from that burning is also part of scope 3. That is the downward. Similarly, with packaging emissions associated with it, the waste that gets dumped, all the emissions that get associated with it, whichever does not get processed, all of this is part of our scope 3 emissions. So there are about 15 categories under scope 3 emissions. To simplify, I've just taken a handful of them. So now this sounds very simple, right? Like everyone's understood how a bakery functions. It runs on electricity. You burn gases to ensure delicious cakes are produced. You buy raw materials, all the emissions associated with that journey, and then you sell the cakes, all the emissions associated with that journey. All of this is scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, right? This, if you do accounting and reporting, will give the entire summary of how much is a bakery. Excuse me. So this will give a summary of how much a company is emitting. Similarly, if this has to be done for a manufacturing company, look at the complexity it will be, right? Look at the scale by which it will happen. The production of the bakery will be compared to the production that happens at factories, right? Multiple gases, right from a AC refrigerant to an extinguisher to all other emission gases, all of that will be there. The vehicles the companies own, that will be there. For logistics, it's just not one or two trucks. It's just like thousands and thousands of trucks, not only on road, on rail, on by air, by sea. it's like a global logistics emissions that will happen inbound and outbound. And then the raw materials is not as simple as it seems, like you buy only 4 or 5 raw materials. You buy at least a minimum of 40,000 to 50,000 individual raw materials at different form factors from your different partners, tier 1 suppliers, tier 2 suppliers, tier 3 suppliers, MSMEs, all of those emissions. And then the packaging waste is even more compounded, right? Like it could be your one-way packaging and all of that gets dumped and whichever does not get processed, right? And the waste that gets associated along with the process emissions. Such huge complexities, right? So now you see why for a manufacturing company, even if you understand the concept, it's not that easy to attain. But do not worry. Good news, Fitsol has figured out a way and has also successfully done this at scale for companies in India and also internationally. So it gives us immense pleasure to now get into today's agenda. Meenakshi, you can pull out the presentation.
Sure.
So myself, Yeshvanth, I'm a chief strategy officer and one of the leaders here at Fitsol. And alongside with me, I have Meenakshi, who is an ESG lead, who's the brains behind all the sustainability that we go implement for customers today or there in the world, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Shall I
So we
dive?
understood.
Oh,
So
go ahead.
so while we've understood why net zero, what is scope 3, right? Why is scope 3 estimation significant today, right? Like why, if there's so much complexity, why should companies even do that? Let's understand that part of it. Meenakshi, next slide.
So, hi everyone. Thanks, Yashwanth, for that wonderful explanation and simplified explanation of the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. I will be diving into some of the nitty-gritties of scope 3 estimation with focus on the manufacturing sector, particularly because this category of scope 3 emissions amongst the three categories, scope 1, 2, 3, is the largest share amongst all three scopes for any company, but particularly for the manufacturing sector. So I'll just dive into why scope 3 estimation is gaining significance currently. So for multiple reasons, number one being that the market pressure is actually rising. Now, globally, large companies are demanding transparent carbon emissions reporting. They want that the suppliers that approach them, they need to accurately measure their own scope 3 emissions, because essentially measuring the scope 3 emissions at the supplier level becomes critical for that company's own emission reduction plans. So when it comes to decarbonizing the supply chain, any large company would want that the emissions should get reduced not just in their own operations, but also in their supply chain, in their value chain operations. So if they want to target the value chain decarbonization, they have to seek emissions reporting from their suppliers. And when they reach out to their suppliers for emissions reporting, it becomes critical that the suppliers have the capability and the knowledge to actually measure and report those emissions, including the scope 3 emissions. Thirdly, nowadays emissions reporting, especially scope 3, has actually significantly become critical when it comes to product level accountability. You are moving from corporate level sustainability to product level sustainability. So at one level, I am looking at what is my scope 3 emissions in total as a company, but I also have to look at what are the product level emissions for the products that I am selling. So when you go to product level sustainability, it becomes very critical that you measure your scope 3 emissions, because that is part of the overall product carbon footprint of any product. So here I've given example that for companies like Honda, BMW, they have developed their net zero strategy. They have developed a strategy to become net zero companies by 2050, 2060. And for that, they are asking their own suppliers to, calculate their product carbon footprint. So depending on whichever supplier gives them the least emission intensive product, they will purchase that product, and in turn, they will decarbonize their own supply chain. So this is how scope 3 estimation is becoming important nowadays. Again, regulatory signals. Scope 3 measurement and Scope 3 reporting is becoming increasingly important, even from regulation aspect. We all know all the listed companies in India today, especially the top 1,000 companies, they have to report what is called a BRSR, the Business Responsibility and Sustainability Reporting. It is a compliance thing. They cannot escape not reporting BRSR. So BRSR reporting requires you to provide details of your scope 3 emissions. So you cannot actually escape calculating your scope 3 emissions because it's a compliance issue now. Second, fourthly, it is cost, innovation, and efficiency related. So unless you estimate your scope 3 emissions, it becomes difficult for you to identify what are the emission hotspots in your value chain, which are the areas which are emitting the most carbon emissions, and what interventions can be done to cut down emissions in those areas. Unless you do a whole value chain mapping, a whole value chain assessment of your emissions, it becomes difficult for you to decarbonize your value chain, and subsequently it will become difficult for you to become a net zero company also. And then finally, investments. Globally, banks and financial institutions are increasingly asking companies and projects that they are about to finance to provide a ESG evaluation also. And in that ESG evaluation, scope 3 emissions arising from that particular project are also, calculated. So scope 3 emissions in general is becoming significant even from the investment aspect.
Meenakshi, just a minute to pass, right? Like while Meenakshi's covered the larger parts, so what we've also understood from the market is that today about 9 out of the 10 companies in India are having to work with Scope 3 on two angles. So either they are listed as they are either listed on stock exchange and are planning to do it as part of the BRSR compliance, or along with their corporate responsibility of being more sustainable. But given that at least most of the companies indirectly do supply to these listed companies, they're under in reverse pressure, which they have never been prepared for it. That's why we understood in the last 7 to 8 months, my team has at least received inbound requests to understand what is Scope 3 and then how do we even how to even achieve and approach this entire gambit of complexity, right? So it's become a clear mandate that because from a complaints angle, it's trickled down from a listed company to all their suppliers directly and indirectly are having to understand this. Even though they've never had a vertical of ESG or sustainability today, a lot of new folks who are either in marketing or in either quality or in either procurement are having to step this, right? Now it's a shared responsibility. One of the larger strategies which was observed in global companies in Europe or US is also being followed now here in India, that a sustainability target or a KRA for a supplier level emissions is not only with the sustainability team but also with the procurement team and also the supply chain management team. So now it becomes a shared responsibility of or us 3 or 4 pillars, and then all of them are taking targets together to say like this year at least 70% of my suppliers will also do baseline reporting, right? They'll start with scope 1, scope 2, and parts of select scope 3 categories. And in that 70%, at least 35 of the most emitting suppliers will also take targets for the next 5 years to see how do they reduce this. And on a brighter side, if you've already worked on it or if you're planning to work on it, you might know that Scope 3 does not have to be an additional cost. Scope 3, after you do the baselining, accounting, reporting, all the sustainable initiatives that you implement will be a cost saving exercise, which is what has been proven. And yeah, that's a good observation and insight we got from the market. I just thought I'll share it with the larger group. Go ahead, Meenakshi.
Yeah, thanks, Yashvanth. And I just want to add here to Yashvanth's point that, a lot of these auto part makers, now they have a mandate from their customers that they have to, start measuring their carbon emissions and also take targets on their carbon emissions as part of their supplier onboarding process and supplier selection criteria. So it's not just that, carbon emissions is something that is only restricted to the large companies. Like Yashvanth said, it has actually become a shared responsibility. So every element of the value chain network, from the large companies to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers, everybody is getting involved in this whole exercise of estimating carbon emissions, scope 3 emissions, and then taking measures to reduce them. And just wanted to highlight here that for the large companies, the large OEMs, the global buyers, all of these companies usually go for ESG disclosures, ESG ratings, so as to show themselves as very sustainability oriented organizations. All these ESG ratings, whether it is ratings like CDP, EcoVadis, MSCI, DJSI, they require scope 3 emissions. They require you to take targets on scope 3 emissions, also to show progress on scope 3 emission reduction. So it's not an optional thing now. Scope 3 emission calculation is becoming mandatory for companies. And then finally, like I said, net zero planning, and if you are taking any science-based target for emission reduction, then scope 3 is mandatory. You cannot take a net zero target without taking a target on scope 3. And you cannot claim yourself to be a net zero company unless you have reduced your scope 3 emissions. Not only, and I'm not saying offset, I'm saying companies have to demonstrate that they have actually reduced their scope 3 emissions through supply related measures and other activities. So I just want to touch upon how scope 3 data is typically collected in any organization. First is that you have to specify the organizational and operational boundary. Now, what are these? Organizational boundary refers to the entities that you're going to include when you start, collecting data. So if an organization is a standalone organization, then obviously the organizational boundary refers to the operations of that particular entity. But if the organization has multiple sister companies, or it has associate companies, or it has subsidiaries, or if a company has multiple plants located across the globe, then choosing which plants need to be covered, then what operations need to be covered in those plants, those things get covered in these boundaries. And then you identify what are the significant scope 3 categories that are applicable for your business. Then second step is collecting the primary data. Now, what is the difference between primary and secondary data? Primary data is the data that comes directly from the source here being the supplier. So if the supplier can give you data related to the emissions in their product, then that becomes primary data for you. And if you are not able to access that data, then you have to rely on what is called as secondary databases, which are industry averages. So there are organizations like UK, DEFRA, there is emission factor databases like USEIO, US EPA, and Exiobase, EcoInvent, etc. So what they've done is they've calculated emissions for a typical industry, and those industry averages then can be used for you to calculate your emissions. This is a typical step-by-step methodology for you to calculate scope 3 emissions. Now coming to the topic of this webinar, which is what are the significant challenges when it comes to scope 3 data collection. Typically for Indian manufacturers and suppliers, based on what we have experienced at Fitsol and otherwise, that suppliers, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, they lack the technical understanding of what scope 3 is. So there is a lack of understanding of what is scope 3, what is GHG protocol, what are the categories of scope 3, which categories are applicable to that particular supplier. All that in-house expertise is missing. And in the absence of this, they have to rely on external sources, external consultants to do the emissions mapping for them. Then limited data. Of course, data is the starting point for emission calculation. But if the company is not capturing data in a structured manner, then using that data to calculate your emissions becomes a challenge. For instance, if the company is tracking the fuel consumed only through the bills, but the quantity of the fuel consumed is not mentioned in that bill, so then it becomes a challenge to estimate the emissions associated with that fuel. This happens in a lot of companies. So if the data is not being captured in the right manner, in a structured manner, so, using that data to calculate emissions becomes a challenge. Then comes inconsistent and poor quality data, similarly linked to that. Unless the site is capturing data in the manner that it needs to calculate emissions, emission calculation becomes a very tedious and a manual exercise. And of course, most of these suppliers, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, since they do not have understanding of GHG protocol, scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, they obviously do not have a knowledge of what emission factor databases need to be used to calculate emissions. So if they don't have access to those databases, then obviously emission calculation becomes difficult. And then finally, if the data is not structured, if the data is not in the manner that it needs to be there for emission calculation, if the data is not in the proper units, the units are inconsistent, then obviously you have to rely on some source to calculate your emissions. Then that some source becomes secondary data collection method, and using that data collection method, you have to then calculate your emissions. What usually happens is that when you rely on secondary sources, it is difficult to get India specific emission factors, so you have to rely on global averages. So generally what happens is that when you rely on global averages, your emission calculation can be a little underestimated or overestimated to some extent. But this is a significant thing, that the challenges due to lack of technology related interventions for calculating GHG emissions. Yashvanth, you want to take this?
Yeah. So, in line with all the points that Meenakshi mentioned in the previous slide, right? I think if you paid attention to it, a lot of that is solvable. But the only challenge is that how scalable is it? Because if you're talking for a manufacturing company, for a monthly average purchase goods data for them is anywhere about 25,000 line item, and for them logistics is about few thousands. And just these are just two, three categories, right? And then even in this, there are sub nuances and details. If someone had to manually track, map, take the right emission factors, verify it, check if it is the latest scientifically proven emission factor, so it's a step-by-step process. A lot of companies historically used to do it manually, and hence, given the challenge, the time-taking process and the cost associated, companies restricted themselves to scope and scope two only because of this challenge. Purely, I've spoken to so many of them to understand that it's been a more of a practical issue as to how can you solve for it, rather than not knowing how to solve for it. Like how to do it was always out there. It's just that how easily can you do it or conveniently can you do it was a challenge, and then people were not able to allocate budgets for that. But it needn't be the same today, right? The advent of AI and then all the LLMs that was going around to efficiently reduce on the time and the steps, and also most accurately calculate for it is being solved for. And we've ourselves seen, I think Meenakshi has been on the receiving end, right? Like she's come from a deeper ESG knowledge to work with our product team. We've seen that all that another candid conversation, we understood that all that used to take time for about weeks to months has been solved for in less than minutes to the seconds, right? And this is what the companies are benefiting today, and companies should mandate because um, your all your government bodies and your international customers are watching for that. Trust me. If you do not start it, they're going to anyways push it for you, and then you should not be that you're not ready with systems and processes, right? So that will demand a lot of data. But after you get the data in a very right format and clean format, right? The AI can do it. In fact, AI is also helping people with cleaning up the data nowadays. That's what our team is also trying to solve for, right? So one good thing is that technology till yesterday was not able to solve for it, and today the modern world, the advent of AI, everything is solvable in this entire GG accounting reporting world, right? And it is also scalable, like scalable for us to read any type of file formats. You don't have to manually capture data, enter it into a format. You just have to upload the PDFs, right? It could be a ledger, it could be a e-way bill, it could be electricity bill. Our AI should be able to automatically fetch for the right data. Again, at back end, do the assessment of matching it with the most accurate and the relevant emission factors, tie it up, calculate the emissions, and then add it to the entire GHG accounting, right? So I think that is where we've been able to see progress, and technology is going to make more heads turn. Looking forward to see how those innovations are only going to help companies, all of us, to solve for this entire carbon emissions management even easily.
Should I move forward?
Yeah, you can go ahead.
So just wanted to explain you, extending what Yashvanth said, that the data related challenges that currently plague scope 3 emission calculation. So, lot of these automotive OEMs depend on steel based products, rubber based products, electronic components, but and they source all these products from, multiple suppliers, but none of these suppliers can provide them, the supplier level emission factor or a product level emission factor for the products that they're purchasing. So it becomes difficult to actually capture that primary data that I was talking about. And in the absence of primary data, then the companies have to rely on secondary sources or generic factors than the actual measured data for calculating their scope 3 emissions. Then, of course, in the automotive supply chain, there are multiple suppliers, there are multiple products. All of those products have different unit of measurement. Some product is coming in kilograms, the other is coming in some kind of sheets. So the unit of measurement becomes cross-sectional area or meter square. But when you start calculating your scope 3 emissions, the units have to be reconciled to ensure that you are choosing the right emission factor for that particular product that you're using. Then, of course, a lack of data visibility becomes a challenge for scope 3 calculation. When companies rely on Excel sheets for capturing their purchase goods data and for capturing their logistics data, there is bound to be errors, and all that exercise becomes very manually tedious. And when you start estimating emissions at the end of the year using those Excel sheets, it obviously becomes a lot of time. It becomes a very time consuming and labor intensive process. So automating this data capturing through digital tools and using digital tools to measure your GHG emissions becomes very critical today. And Yashvanth like mentioned that Fitsol is already in that process of enabling companies to measure their GHG emissions through digital tools, and it has actually simplified this task to a very large extent. All of these data challenges that I am talking about, uh, particularly related to manual entry of data, has been actually significantly solved because of digital tools today. I want to touch upon briefly about the idea of ESG assessment and how ESG assessments can actually help companies, suppliers, as well as buyers, particularly in their scope 3 emissions estimation. So what ESG assessment essentially is, it is a set of questions that you ask your supplier to respond to, and based on those questions spread across environment, social, governance sectors, you are able to identify what kind of uh, data monitoring methods the supplier has, what kind of policies they have in place in ESG, what kind of KPIs they are capturing on their site, what are their governance mechanisms, how compliant are they with the regulations, the upcoming regulations, and what actions or measures they are taking to improve their ESG footprint, or just overall sustainability metric. So when companies resort to ESG assessments, this can be before you onboard a supplier, or it can be even after you onboard the supplier. You understand the data gaps and the quality issues on the supplier end. It gives you better visibility of scope 3 emissions because you can ask your supplier as to what they are capturing in terms of their GHG emissions, including their scope 3 emissions. You can also help, and this knowledge can then enable you to recommend your suppliers. And in case the supplier is not capturing their scope 3 emissions, or the supplier does not have any mechanism to capture their GHG emissions at all, then it becomes a simple recommendation. It becomes a straightforward recommendation to ask them to develop some kind of a governance mechanism that enables them to capture the data required for emission calculation. And then it also enables large companies to develop tailor-made or customized supplier engagement programs. They can target, they can classify their suppliers in terms of leaders, intermediate performers, and low performers, and then develop tailor-made programs so that they can work with the suppliers and improve the supplier level sustainability footprint and supplier level emissions reporting. So ESG assessments can enable that kind of visibility into scope 3 data, or in general visibility into the ESG uh, performance of any company, any supplier. Now, I'll take a pause here. Yashwanth, you want to add something?
No, I think that's very well rounded. And in fact, also tying up to one of your earlier points, right? Like, for companies to do BRSR, ESG, and any other form of compliance reporting, Scope 3 is given a huge weightage, right? People, even starting with, there could be different types of licenses, certifications, and reporting. if people are even starting with scope 3, we've seen year on year the grading and the scoring improved for companies, right? Because that gives a signal to the governing or the auditing bodies that this company is voluntarily or as per complaints starting this entire complex process of scope 3. And right, even to do baselining gives a huge credibility to the company because you're out there exposing the entire emissions, and then only then you'll be able to take targets, right? If not, all as you mentioned, every net zero target is headed nowhere without the scope 3 details coming inside.
Thanks, Yashwanth. So I want to now touch upon the idea of how to build emissions data that is defensible, comparable, and repeatable. Now, why these three terms were used? The reason why I want to touch upon this is because when companies go for ESG ratings, typically nowadays ESG ratings not only want you to report your scope 3 emissions, they also want you to provide details of how these scope 3 emissions were calculated, what assumptions were used, what logics were used, and most importantly, they want details of third party verification of your scope 3 emissions data. So it's not just that you can just simply calculate your emissions calculation has to be verified by a third party. That, and it has to be and some rating agencies also require you to provide a public disclosure of the assurance statement that mentions that the company has actually you actually used a third party to get their scope 3 data verified. So these factors then become critical, that the scope 3 emission calculation has to be defended. It has to be defensible. It can be compared across companies. So there has to be a standard way of reporting scope 3 emissions, and it has to be repeatable. This is some exercise that cannot happen just once a year, once for one company. It has to occur every year so that you can see progress in terms of any reduction, increase, or decrease. So this is what we want to target, that how we can move towards audit ready or third party verification ready decision grade scope 3 data. Number one is that you need to define the governance and boundaries. So a lot of companies that we work with, the major challenge is that they simply don't know who is responsible for which type of data. So identifying, first of all, the relevant categories of scope 3 for your business, then assigning the data collection ownership to the respective team in the organization who will be responsible for monitoring data related to that particular category, and then collating data from all these teams at one level, and then collating this data, and then finally doing the emission calculation. This governance mechanism needs to be established in every organization for effective reporting of scope 3 data. And secondly, you have to shift towards improving the data quality also, and not just improving the coverage. You can include 10 entities in your reporting boundaries, or you can include 20 entities in your reporting boundary. But if you are not, if you're relying only on spend-based emission factors, spend-based meaning that there is an emission factor database that relies only on the cost of the goods procured. So if you're not going to shift to primary data and you keep relying on secondary data through these spend-based emission factors, then your emission inventory will remain, less accurate. So the idea is to improve the data quality so you can shift from spend-based or secondary data sources to primary data sources. Then you need to prioritize your emission categories also. In every company, there are multiple scope 3 categories that are applicable, but some of the categories are highly emission intensive. So how do you target reducing emissions in those categories? And then targeting your tier 1 suppliers. When you target your tier 1 suppliers, you can also ask your tier 1 suppliers to target their tier 1 suppliers. So through a cascading effect, the benefits of the supply chain decarbonization can travel down the value chain. And then, of course, GHG data requests can be embedded in contract itself. So whenever you onboard a supplier in the supplier selection criteria, GHG emissions reporting can be one aspect. Then you can obviously ask your suppliers to, periodically, quarterly or half yearly give you data for their emissions, so that you can also have a track of how your suppliers are performing in terms of reducing their emissions. And then, of course, final level, once you have done the whole exercise of calculating your emissions, conduct an internal review of the calculated emissions before you actually reach out to a third party for external verification of that GHG data. For that, it is important that you maintain proper logs, proper bills, proper documents that support your emission calculations, whatever assumptions you're using that needs to be documented, whatever logic you're using, everything has to be documented properly. And as long as you have proper evidence to support your calculations, third party verification will never be a challenging exercise. So with this, I think I've come to the fag end of my presentation. I would ask Yeshvanth to please sum it up.
No, I think the presentation has itself been comprehensive to help simplify people what is scope 3 and why is it even important, right? Um, we have primarily conducted this session to make it more conversational to see what are the other challenges that companies also face. So probably after this, I would request if anyone could volunteer on to if they have had experiences in their company as to how did they approach scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, if at all they've done, or if they're wanting to approach scope 3, where are they facing challenges, right? And if they've successfully implemented something, it is even better for the larger group to understand as a cross-learning exercise across ecosystem. It will be beneficial for everyone. But in my understanding, what has come to the brighter picture is that India is not looking at scope 3 as voluntary going further. The markets demand that, the end customers internationally demand that, right? And with the EU trade and all getting relaxed, right? It's even more important that even more textile companies are going to come chase scope 3 is what I understand as per my recent understanding from yesterday to today by talking to a lot of consultants and then brand owners. So yeah, it's time that people start today. It's not going to be easy. And majorly for tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, where you've not had budgets around sustainability ESG. Do not fear. Start somewhere. Start simple, and do reach out to us if we could help you in any way. We do run something called as a capacity building program where we just don't give a tool, but we also allocate some of our best brains and minds on the job to help you understand, help you find a champion in the company and train them to be the sustainability lead going further, right? So that you're able to answer to any of the listed companies also if they have to work with, right? If in customers are asking for any details or the approach, your champions will be able to answer it. So we'll be comprehensively training them on the capacity building program of why GH accounting reporting, why ESG, how do they do that, what has gone into every part of the calculation, and how have they approached it. And while the tool does the scaling and everything, your teams will be very well uplifted and equipped on answering any of these queries. But please feel free to share any of your learnings or experiences in handling GG accounting and reporting. And if you really innovated or solved for something, please feel free to share that also to the larger group, as I mentioned. And if there are any other queries, please drop that also. Meenakshi, me, or Anjali will pick it up. Okay, I think one of them has asked if we could share the presentation as public share. Currently, we don't do that, but you can write to us and let us know why and who wants to understand that. We'll probably make it more contextual because this is being made for a general audience. I always believe in sharing more contextual driven presentations rather than sharing generic presentations to everyone. So that is one part. And I think there are two more questions. How to make process of scope measurement most cost effective for MSMEs? Okay, that I'll take it up. I think Meenakshi might want to take up the next question from Joshua after I answer Mr. Soumyajit. Soumyajit, so firstly, it also boils down to your bandwidth, right? Like how many team members are you ready to allocate and are they ready to stretch, right? Given that it's going to be new for you, someone should volunteer so that you do not want to incur another cost of a ESG person internally, right? That could go anywhere between 8 lakhs to 15 lakhs. So if you could cut on that and optimize for someone who could be a champion, who could be trained to do all of this work in the coming years. So you have to first identify that person internally, and then obviously onboard some external partners like Fitsol and so many others who could help that person implement it internally. Could be one way where it could be very cost effective. This is what I've seen. A lot of MSMEs are currently working with us and doing that. So they have never had a ESG person because for them it is a straight sudden budget hit, right? Like suddenly if 8 lakhs to 15 lakhs is too much of a cost. Rather, onboarding a partner like us is important. But before that step, identifying a sustainability champion or a decarbonization champion internally is a first step. Once you've done that, you've efficiently netted off about average 10 to 12 lakhs of per year cost. And then you can onboard us and make it a more cost effective proposal to take it further. Meenakshi, you want to take up the next one?
Yeah, it's actually less of a question and more of a couple of
Okay.
observations by Joshua. So yeah, Joshua, you rightly mentioned areas where scope 3 becomes challenging, moving from spend-based to activity-based, which leads to rise in scope 3 emissions and requires selective re-baselining. So this is, yes, a challenge. A lot of companies, because they don't have access to primary data, they rely on spend-based methods. But what we recommend to some of our suppliers is that, try to go for a hybrid method, that for the method, for the, just to start your scope 3 calculation, identify the materials for which identify the weight based materials for which the units are kilograms or tons, and then use the average or industry average databases to calculate emissions for those particular weight based products. And for the other products where the unit of measurement is not consistent because the material is either being procured in pieces or in square feet or in kilo pieces, etc., you can use a spend based method. So shifting from purely spend based to a hybrid method, which is a combination of average data and spend based, and then from hybrid method to average data, which is relying only on industry averages, and then from average data to the primary data method. Second and third point are also valid: disaggregating entity-wide GHG emissions and reconciling targets allocated to specific verticals and regions, specific to large companies only, not to small MSMEs, and employing digital carbon to ensure rational allocations are tracked. This is something that our tool at Fitsol is also doing. So what we do is that through our tool, the suppliers are onboarded, their GHG emissions are calculated, and depending on the share of their uh, share of the material that they have sold to the key client or the key manufacturer, the emissions are appropriately allocated. So digital tools can do the allocation rationally. Manually it becomes a very tedious exercise. So yeah.
But also to add on, Joshua, currently today, when we're working with most of the listed companies or the international companies, they are essentially wanting to move from a spend-based to activity-based norms, right? Like, which means it could essentially increase the timeline from probably about a 1.5x to 2x of the timeline that usually been incurred for the calculation. But given the granularity of data and then the confidence of the emissions that you get a hold of it, right? It helps them set strategies for long term, right? So yeah, it is a evolving trend, I would say, rather than what it was for the last 4 or 5 years, but it is heading the right direction. And also one more important point about tracking emissions in a very region wise or a plant wise is important because in most cases we've seen one particular brand has multiple manufacturing units based out of within India and also a few others globally, right? So to track them at a plant level and also to give them targets gives them a sense of shared responsibility because we are able to again nominate sub owners, right? Or with every plant. While there is a corporate level champion, there could be also a plant level champion who will be driving initiatives apart from after what has been done with the accounting and reporting. And Misha, I think it will be very specific and it could go into very technicalities of that. Please feel free to drop us a message or mail. We'll be happy to respond that on a mail or get on a call to explain it to you. But yeah, thank you everyone for sharing your insights and then also your queries. If there are any other points, please feel free to add on to it. If not, I think we will call it a day after a very healthy discussion.
Do we have any more questions? Okay, thank you so much for joining us for the webinar. Thank you, Yeshwanth and Meenakshi. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Also, we would be sharing this on our YouTube channel. So I would be sending the link to everyone in case anybody wants to go over it again. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.